In the winter of 192 AD, a young potter named Marcus limped through the narrow streets of Rome's Subura district, his left foot forever twisted from a childhood accident. He had no way of knowing that within days, Roman Emperor Commodus would order every person in the city missing feet to be dragged from their homes, whether they had lost limbs in accidents, through illness, or been born that way made no difference. Marcus, along with dozens of others, would be hauled to the Colosseum, tied together with thick ropes and forced to dress as mythical giants, while thousands of Romans filled the arena to watch their emperor club them to death with his bare hands. This wasn't war, this wasn't justice. This was systematic genocide disguised as entertainment, and Rome paid millions of sesterces for the privilege of watching their emperor murder the most vulnerable people in the empire. The story you're about to hear isn't just about a mad emperor. It's about how absolute power can transform a human being into something so monstrous that he would hunt down disabled people for sport, charge his own empire for the privilege of watching him do it, and convince an entire civilization to applaud as he turned mass murder into a divine spectacle. What you'll discover about Commodus will challenge everything you thought you knew about the depths human cruelty can reach when combined with unlimited authority and divine delusion. Popular films like Gladiator have sanitized Commodus into merely a corrupt emperor obsessed with gladiatorial combat, but the reality was infinitely more disturbing. While Hollywood shows him as a villain who fights fair duels in the arena, contemporary historians recorded something far more sinister: a systematic campaign of terror against Rome's most defenseless citizens, disguised as religious ceremony and charged to the empire as entertainment expenses. Marcus the Potter had heard whispers in the taverns, stories dismissed as too horrible to believe. An emperor who didn't just fight gladiators, but who had invented new forms of cruelty specifically designed to torment those who couldn't fight back. The truth, documented by Roman historians who witnessed these events, reveals a ruler who used his divine authority to hunt, capture, and slaughter disabled people while convincing an entire empire that they were watching sacred justice unfold before their eyes. The year was 180 AD, and Commodus inherited the throne of the Roman Empire at its absolute peak, a moment when one man controlled more territory and more lives than any ruler in human history. His father, Marcus Aurelius, had been considered the greatest philosopher-emperor in Roman history, expanding the empire's borders while writing timeless works on virtue and wisdom that still echo through the centuries. The empire stretched from the misty hills of Britain to the burning sands of Egypt, from the Atlantic shores of Spain to the ancient cities of the Middle East. But Commodus was not his father. From childhood, he had shown disturbing obsessions with violence and spectacle that made even hardened Roman soldiers uncomfortable. While other imperial children studied philosophy and statecraft under the greatest minds of the age, Commodus spent his time with gladiators, learning to fight, kill, and perform for crowds. His father had hoped that military service would mature the boy into a worthy successor, but when Marcus Aurelius died on the cold Danube frontier, Rome found itself ruled by a 19-year-old who believed he was the god Hercules reincarnated. The Roman Empire had always been violent, but it was violence with purpose. Conquest that brought order, discipline that created civilization, brutality that served the greater good of Roman peace. Under Commodus, violence became an end in itself, a perverse art form that served only his twisted imagination. Within months of taking power, he abandoned all pretense of governing, leaving the empire's vast administration to corrupt favorites while he pursued his true passion, turning the Colosseum into his personal playground, where he could act out his divine fantasies before captive audiences of terrified citizens. Marcus, working clay in his small workshop near the Tiber, would have felt the tremors of this transformation ripple through Roman society. The way conversations grew quieter, how people began watching each other with new suspicion. The gradual realization that the golden age of the Antonines had died with Marcus Aurelius. The psychological torment began long before the actual killings, and for Marcus and others like him, it started with a knock at the door. Commodus's agents would sweep through Rome's poorest districts with methodical precision, systematically identifying and cataloguing every person who was missing feet, whether through accident, illness, or birth defects. Contemporary accounts describe how families would hide their disabled relatives in cellars and storage rooms, knowing that discovery meant certain death. But the emperor's men were thorough, and neighbors, terrified for their own safety, often betrayed those they once called friends. Marcus watched from his window as the imperial agents moved house to house, carrying scrolls and making notes with the dispassionate efficiency of tax collectors. When they reached his door, he knew there was no point in running. Where could a man with a twisted foot hide in an empire that spanned 3 continents? The process of selection was deliberately cruel, designed to maximize terror and helplessness. Commodus's men would visit homes, conduct inspections, and compile lists of potential victims with the same bureaucratic precision that Rome used to organize its legions or collect its taxes. Those selected, Marcus among them, would be told they were being honored to participate in sacred games honoring Hercules, that their sacrifice would please the gods and bring divine favor to the empire. But behind this veneer of religious ceremony lay the calculating mind of a sadist who understood that hope was the cruelest weapon of all. Families were forbidden to mourn or protest. To do so was considered treason against the emperor's divine will, punishable by joining their loved ones in the arena. The waiting was perhaps the worst part of the ordeal. Marcus found himself held in the Colosseum's underground chambers for days that stretched into weeks, knowing he would die, but not knowing when. The cramped cells echoed with the sounds of other prisoners, some weeping, others praying to gods who seemed to have abandoned them, a few driven to madness by the anticipation. Above them, they could hear the crowds, the roar of approval, as other entertainments took place, always wondering if their turn had come. Guards would deliberately feed this terror, moving through the cells with updates and stories about how previous groups had died, how long it had taken, how much the emperor had enjoyed their suffering, which victims had begged the loudest before the end came. What made this psychological torture particularly cruel was the religious justification that Commodus had woven around the murders. Marcus and the others were told they were playing essential roles in divine theatre, that their deaths would honor the gods and ensure Rome's continued prosperity. When the day finally came, Marcus discovered that the actual killings followed a horrific pattern that Commodus had refined over multiple performances, each detail calculated to maximize both spectacle and suffering. The disabled victims were dragged from their underground cells and forced into elaborate costumes designed to transform them from human beings into mythological creatures, a dehumanization that was as psychological as it was physical. Marcus found himself dressed in a crude costume meant to represent a giant, with fake serpents attached to his twisted foot to simulate the limbs of mythical creatures. The costume was heavy, uncomfortable, and deliberately humiliating, designed not just to create the illusion of monsters, but to strip away the last vestiges of dignity from men who were about to die. Crude masks completed their transformation into non-human entities, while arena workers applied makeup and props with the same attention to detail that other productions might use for a comedy or tragedy. Once costumed, the victims were brought into the arena and physically tied together with thick ropes that bit into their skin, creating a helpless cluster of human beings unable to move independently or defend themselves. The binding was deliberately tight and painful, designed to restrict movement while ensuring that no one could escape the kill zone or help their fellow victims. Marcus felt the rope cutting into his arms as he was lashed to men he had never met. A baker from the Aventine, a veteran who had lost his foot in Germania, a young man born without toes who had spent his life begging near the Forum. The crowd that gathered to watch these spectacles was enormous. Tens of thousands of Romans packed into the Colosseum, many of whom had been forced to attend under threat of their own punishment. As Marcus looked up at the sea of faces, he could see the complex mixture of emotions rippling through the audience. Horror, fascination, fear, and a terrible excitement that spoke to humanity's darkest impulses. Commodus would then enter the arena dressed as Hercules, complete with lion skin and massive club, his muscular frame gleaming with oil as he struck poses for the crowd. The emperor would circle his bound victims slowly, building suspense for the audience while prolonging the terror of those about to die. Marcus watched the emperor approach, noting how Commodus seemed to take genuine pleasure in the fear he could see in their eyes, savoring not just the anticipation of killing, but the psychological dominance over completely helpless human beings. The actual murders were systematic and brutal, with Commodus using his club to strike each victim repeatedly. Marcus, bound near the center of the group, watched in growing horror as the emperor worked his way through their number with methodical precision. The blows often required multiple strikes to achieve death, and Commodus seemed to take pleasure in the prolonged nature of these executions, making sure each death was visible to the entire audience, while he paused between killings to acknowledge crowd reactions and raise his bloodied club in triumph. Perhaps most disturbing was how Commodus insisted that his victims maintain their roles as giants, even while being killed, requiring them to make appropriate sounds and gestures until death finally silenced them. Arena workers were positioned around the killing ground to adjust costumes and props between murders, ensuring that the mythological illusion remained intact throughout the massacre. As the club descended toward Marcus for the final time, he thought not of the emperor's delusions or the cheering crowds, but of the clay vessels he would never finish, the simple life he would never return to. The potter who had spent his days creating beauty from earth would become nothing more than a footnote in history's most grotesque spectacle. When Marcus's broken body finally fell silent, Commodus raised his bloodied club to acknowledge the roar of approval from the crowd. The emperor had claimed another victim in his divine performance, another giant defeated by the reincarnated Hercules. But Marcus was not a giant or a monster. He was a man whose only crime was to have a twisted foot. The arena workers dragged Marcus's corpse away with the same efficient indifference they showed to all the other bodies, his blood mixing with the sand that would soon be raked clean for the next entertainment. His workshop near the Tiber stood empty that night, half-finished pottery still waiting on the wheel, testament to a life cut short by the calculated cruelty of absolute power. The madness could not last forever. By 192 AD, even Rome's capacity for horror had reached its limit. When Commodus's mistress Marcia discovered a death list that included her own name, she realized the emperor's paranoia had finally overreached itself. The man who had murdered the empire's most vulnerable citizens had finally threatened those with the power to fight back. On December 31st, 192 AD, Marcia attempted to poison Commodus during his evening meal, but when he vomited up the poison, his wrestling partner Narcissus strangled him in his bath. The emperor, who had clubbed countless helpless victims to death, died naked and defenseless. A lonely, ignoble end for a man who had orchestrated such spectacular public violence. The story of Commodus and Marcus reveals how quickly civilization can collapse when those in power lose their moral compass. In less than 12 years, one man transformed the world's most advanced society into an enthusiastic audience for systematic genocide. Marcus the Potter never lived to see his emperor's downfall, never knew that his death would be remembered as a warning from history. His story serves as a reminder that those society considers most vulnerable are often the first victims when institutional protections fail. The ultimate tragedy is not just the disabled people Commodus murdered, but what their deaths reveal about the human capacity for both cruelty and complicity. In remembering Marcus, we honor not only his suffering, but our obligation to recognize and resist such patterns whenever they emerge.